Welcome to my Bitcoin price update for October. Please remember I'm just doing this for fun as a hobby, and make sure you speak to a financial advisor before you buy any Bitcoin. So when you look at the long-term Bitcoin chart, it really does resemble a new asset class finding a price. But of course, there's always lots of ups and downs along that journey, and each of these speculative bubbles have in the past coincided with events that have led to lots of new money coming into Bitcoin. The most recent being the ETF bubble, where now loads of baby boomers are buying Bitcoin via ETFs. Also, there's been a lot of public companies buying Bitcoin in the last few years. So that's also contributed to the current bull market along with the ETFs. So I am convinced that this is another speculative bubble, just the same as all of the previous ones. And so the question is, how do you time this if you want to try and sell at the peak of this bubble? Now, first of all, I'm coming into all of this from the aspect of a long-term investor. So that's someone who's acquired their Bitcoin many years ago. And so if you bought or sold Bitcoin anytime in the last year, this video isn't for you. You need to go over to the Tony Vay's channel. For long-term investors who may typically have acquired their Bitcoin well below 50,000 and maybe even something like 25,000, you could actually sell 10 or 20% below the current price and you've still made a real killing. And on that basis, I've got some stop losses here, and they're based off this logarithmic chart. If you look at the long-term price of Bitcoin using a logarithmic scale, it's a lot more manageable. And the first interesting thing is following the Bitcoin Cash hard fork, we saw a definite change in the gradient at which the price has generally gone up. And that's kind of quite interesting. But ever since that happened in 2017, there's this clear trend line here going all the way back to certainly 2018. And you'd say that it would be very improbable for the price to go below that line. And when I switch back to my linear scale, that's this blue line down here. This blue line down here, that's the extrapolation of line, this line here, acquired on the logarithmic chart. We also see that since 2023, when this current bull run really got going, we have this trend line here forming the bottom of that. So in terms of timing the current bull run, I'd say that as breaking below that would be a kind of fairly unlikely thing to happen so long as we're still in this bull run. Going into my linear chart here, that's this blue line here. And it's very satisfying to see that I've had this in place for quite a few months. And just when things started to look really bad, when I did my video last month, the Bitcoin price has ricocheted off this log line that I drew. Now, in terms of timing as well, which does definitely play into my considerations, all of these cycles, it turns out, the tops of all of these cycles have been separated since 2013 by exactly 16 quarters, which really is quite remarkable. And we're currently at the next 16th quarter, this quarter that we've just entered. Some people have said that this 4-year pattern is actually linked to liquidity based on the US elections. Because the US governments want to get elected and then get through the midterms, apparently the liquidity pumped into the system in order to rig that is in coordination with this Bitcoin behavior. Who knows if that's the case or not? But all the same, this does make for a nice kind of base case to work from. And then if it doesn't work out this quarter, we can always reassess then. But currently, based on that, for my base case, I've got us peaking within that time frame, i.e., within the next quarter. If you go through and look at all the previous Bitcoin cycles, the last one was actually a bit messed up because China banned Bitcoin mining around here, turning it into a bit of a funny one. But all the other ones have a particular pattern. And the current cycle seems to be overlapping with the more classic Bitcoin price cycles, as exemplified in 2017, for example. And in these cases, going back to these other ones as well, you really got the bulk of the action in the last 2 months. And so, assuming that that same thing will repeat itself, which I know is a very big assumption to make, it should be pointed out. But were you to make that insane assumption, that would actually make these kind of price targets here of between 200 and 400,000 quite realistic. And really, I think it would be more closer to the 400 than the 200 based on how much the previous bubbles have gone up by in the last couple of months. And also, this nice channel we've got formed here on the logarithmic chart makes that 400k look actually fairly realistic. Now, I should say, of course, this is really a stab in the dark, trying to do what you can, really just using technical analysis. And then I am lining that up with some macro data to do as good a job of it as I can. But admitting that it is just a stab in the dark, it's still important to have some kind of game plan and some kind of exit strategy. And of course, this is also why it's important that someone should be approaching this as a long-term investor and not a trader. And I definitely wouldn't be buying any Bitcoin now. So I've explained my stab in the dark kind of price targeting here with my kill box I've put in place here, and explained this stop loss here really, which is based on my logarithmic charting. I've got also another stop loss here, which is based on the 52-week moving average. And this is a trend that's actually supported the Bitcoin price going all the way back to 2020. And so, what I would say is, if you were like a long term investor and these are kind of levels that I'd be looking at, in which case you still would have done very well. That really finishes my price talk. So, now I'm just going to go through some of the fundamental metrics that I've been following. First of all, this is the age of all Bitcoin. And it's remarkable how only a very small percentage of it really are people who've held it for longer than a cycle. That means they've held it since January of 2022. Most of the Bitcoin that's circulating is new Bitcoin. We see here how the ETFs are now at 7%. And remember that that figure was 0% as early as in January 2024. So that for me really does show how the new money rushing in this time for this bubble is baby boomers with their ETFs. We've also got MicroStrategy and other public companies who've also mopped up a lot of this Bitcoin in the last few years. 11% is retail held on exchanges, at least from my data from CoinGlass, and 2% are owned by countries. It's a little alarming always to me how 32% is liquid Bitcoin that can't be assigned. And this is where you've always got to remember Bitcoin is a high risk asset. You really have to be careful what proportion of your overall portfolio you are investing into Bitcoin. In terms of the spot ETF flows, I've already shown that, but down here we have the actual assets under the management and number of Bitcoin, and we see it's still a bullish pattern continuing. Now, I get different data depending on if I look at the block.co or or treasuries.bitbo, but this is still good for kind of trend following. I've got the feeling that the block gives more accurate data, but I have to use the treasuries because that links it up because that gives me info on the company's holdings. According to the block, we definitely saw some good momentum with ETF inflows actually in the last week, as you can see in this diagram here. But even actually going back a month, generally it's still inflows. And everywhere else, there's been continued people buying Bitcoin rather than selling it, although it's not been as strong a trend as we've seen earlier in the year. So here I've got all these different entities buying Bitcoin. And as you can see, it's kind of been a mild, it's been positive but mild, really, when you look at September overall, and you get a good kind of overview from this presentation as well, and you can see where the change from green to now more black here. Maybe we did lose a bit of momentum the last couple of months. In terms of Bitcoin held on exchanges, we saw it sharply rise in the last few days. It's been interesting to see the sudden return of enthusiasm. In terms of MicroStrategy, it's all shuddered to a halt. Now, I had been using MicroStrategy as kind of one of my main bull indicators or one of my main KPIs. I'm starting to wonder, though, if the game's up for MicroStrategy. Obviously, the Mr. stock is completely overvalued, kind of ridiculously overvalued. And now, unlike at the beginning of the year, there's all these other options for people all these other stocks that people can invest in to kind of try and directly invest into the Bitcoin price. So I'm kind of wondering if it's the game's over for MicroStrategy, wondering if it's going to be very difficult for MicroStrategy to keep raising money, making this perhaps a not so useful KPI, but I'll keep updating it. In terms of countries' holdings, no change at all. In terms of public companies' holdings, there's no change in the league table positions. But notable increases were Marathon Digital, who are Nasdaq listed, who increased their BTC holdings by 4%, and Galaxy Digital, who increased their holdings by 33%. In terms of private companies, there was no change. I've got here my KPI dashboard. In terms of the cycle, we're still on course for a classic Bitcoin bubble like we had in 2017. In terms of the ETFs, they're still buying. In terms of public companies, they're still buying. And the pace in which it's happening doesn't indicate a top at the moment. In terms of MicroStrategy, they seem frozen in their tracks at the moment. And in terms of these other parameters, in terms of comparing the Bitcoin market cap against M2 money supply, the S&P 500 market cap, and if I compare the value of Bitcoin ETFs against the value of all US ETFs, none of these numbers look anything too crazy at the moment. So overall, technically the bull market's still on, and it's great how the Bitcoin price ricocheted off my log line here. However, looking at the ETF buying and the company buying, I'd say that we still have kind of lost a bit of momentum in terms of the previous month. So some soberness is required, but if the ETF buying of the last week was to continue, remember we've only got a few days data at the moment, but if that was to continue, then everything will be forming up perfectly. So that completes my video. I hope you found it useful. Make sure you speak to a qualified financial advisor before taking any investment advice, especially involving Bitcoin, and I'll speak to you at the next video. I do videos like this one just for fun as a hobby. It's for entertainment purposes only. Always consult a qualified financial advisor before making any investment decision.